The last two cultures, as I said, one is the academy culture, the other one is the fortress culture. I'll skip to the fortress culture because it's really the easiest one to kind of explain. The fortress culture is the company that's in survival mode. They have to really turn in on themselves, try to fix their problems internally before they can start to think about competing, stabilizing, and growing. When you think about a company that's really on the verge of bankruptcy or on the verge of disappearing, they have to kind of change their culture very radically and make changes that are going to systematically change the essence of the company. So a fortress culture is really in danger of failing. And they have to create this fortress, if you will, in order to allow themselves to survive. They can't deal with other stuff till they get, their home fires all in order. And once that's in order, they can start to then grow and think about how they want to rebuild their culture to be much more functional and growth-oriented. The academy culture is kind of like the club culture, but what we might find in some companies is that it's not one uniform club culture, that there may be what we call these individualized cultures, and we call them the academy cultures, because if you look at GM, for example, depending on whether you are a Chevy person or whether you like Buick or whether you like GMC trucks, they're different car companies, all under the GM umbrella. But interestingly, the culture for each one of those is very unique. At one point in time, GM owned Saab, and GM also owned Saturn. Saturn now has long since disappeared. But the academy culture, you can see in that example how the people who work for Saab and for Saturn were different than the people who work for Chevy. It's just really unique with different cultures. I mean, people didn't really move from culture to culture. Once you establish yourself with one sort of division of the company and one way of doing things, you didn't really mix with the other departments. So there wasn't a lot of interdepartmental or cross-division communication and influence. You pretty much stayed in your little bubble in your one division and you didn't really interact with others. So that's how those four basic categories work. Again, the baseball team, club, academy, and fortress cultures all are sort of unique ways. And I'm sure that there's more ways of defining corporate cultures. These are great examples of some of the major ones, but there are other ways of thinking about culture, and as our environments change and as the world changes around us and we explore new ideas and new ways of being, we'll see more sort of prototypes of what cultures should be. Companies use a number of different tools to facilitate and transmit culture. We talked a few moments ago about how can we perceive what a culture is by looking at how they treat their employees and their customers and those sorts of things. But what are the mechanisms that we use in order to get to that place? First of all, companies use symbols, like objects or acts or events that have meaning. And so there may be symbols like our logo that is a great example of what our values are, or slogans that we might use. Stories are the narratives. It's not just a slogan, but it's a larger, more detailed narrative about the way that the company was founded and what it means. We know the story of, HP. We know the story of 3M. We know the story of Apple and IBM and AT&T and all these major corporations, even Southwest Airlines. They all have stories about what they are about, how they were founded, and how these stories reflect their key values. For years, IBM had a reputation of not laying people off, and that was part of their story and part of their narrative, and that was part of their culture. And then they got to a point where they became so big and so heavy and so inflexible that they had to change their story. They became, that fortress culture that I mentioned before. They turned in on themselves. They made changes to their culture. They had to get rid of that old narrative and develop a new narrative about who they were and what they stood for. Some of the values stayed the same, but Lou Gerstner, when he stepped in there in the late 80s and early 90s, realized that he needed to make some massive changes. And so what he did was get rid of the narrative that no one would ever lose their job. that no one would ever get laid off. He said that has to change because it would be great if we could keep everybody employed for life, but the economy doesn't allow that anymore. The world economy doesn't allow that anymore. Heroes, I know as I've already talked about, are people or figures who represent key aspects of the company culture, and heroes are Steve Jobs and Herb Kelleher and Ben and Jerry. These guys are heroes because they really exemplify what the culture is for the company. Other things that we use for transmitting culture are rites of passage, where we move from one status to another, and there are great examples of rites of passage when we become an officer in a bank, or when we get tenure in a university, or when we move from, being on probation to being a full-blown employee with all the benefits, right? So there's this transition, and this transition from sort of, moderately unimportant to important to having more status in this new role. There's a rite of passage there, and it feels good, and we honor those rites of passages. The rite of enhancement is where we see the social identity or the status of employees changes. And so as our social identities and the rite of enhancement and the way that we see our employees changes, and we give them some value. So we might honor them at the end of the year with a company Christmas party and awards and gifts and bonuses, because we're excited about what they've done for us, and we want to we like to honor them in that way, and what their identity is. A rite of renewal is where we are going through some changes, and we want to kind of look back on what are the things that really hold us together, what are the things that are part of our core values. So when we're in this state of flux, it's very important that you make sure you're really clear about, no matter what these changes are that are going on around us, we have some core values that we need to be sticking with, and so we try to use our social structures and kind of the processes we use to institute change and the narrative that we have around change to really make sure people are clear that this is what our culture is, this is what's important, and sort of renewing our values around that. And the rite of integration is the things that we do to kind of bind people together. And a rite of integration might be the company picnic, or it might be the bowling league that happens on Friday nights. The goal here is that we want to simply find ways to get people to feel connected to each other. And this is really important if you think about it in a high sociability corporate culture, right? Maybe not so much, in a culture that's more mercenary or fragmented, but in cultures where sociability is really important, these rites of integration are the ways that we keep people connected to each other, even if we're busy and going about our own way. But that company picnic and those sorts of things really make a difference in the way that we address and connecting ourselves to others. Culture has to be taken into consideration when we are developing or changing our corporate strategies. And this 2x2 Matrix, I think, does a really great job of discussing how we have to marry these two ideas together. For example, let's go to the lower left-hand corner, few changes and low compatibility. If we have very few changes that we're making to our culture, to our strategy, so there's just a few minor things that we're doing, and it's not very compatible with our corporate culture, we sort of downplay the culture. We don't really use the culture to help us institute the change. We simply downplay it and really focus on perhaps the novelty of the new idea or what the new opportunity will give us by making these changes to our strategy. But we really don't want to use the culture in this circumstance because it may come back to bite us. It may have a counter effect where someone will say, well, this is not consistent with our culture, and thus they may start to resist those changes no matter how few that they are. If you have a very few changes and you have high compatibility, if you move over to the right from there, it tends to have more of a, you want to use a more synergistic focus. It tends to work hand in hand so that we have a few changes, but if it's really compatible with our culture, use the culture to reinforce why the change is good. You know, you can say our company culture has always been about helping people. So this is what we're doing. We're doing this to help people, to help our customers, to help our employees. So you want to use the culture to your advantage in that circumstance. As we move up to the many changes, high compatibility, this is a challenging point, but not incredibly difficult when it's consistent with our corporate culture. People don't like to be changed. People don't like change, and they don't like to be changed. But when we can demonstrate that it is consistent with our norms and our values and our mission, it makes it easier for people to swallow. They may have some beginning residual challenges with those changes, but ultimately, the more that we use our culture and the symbols and the stories and the rites of passage and enhancement, the better off we are. That will make those changes much easier. Lastly, when we have to make a lot of changes to our culture, or a lot of changes to our strategy, and they are not very compatible with our culture, this is the tough point. This is the hardest place. We have a lot that we need to do, and we need to completely turn our company on its head and change the way that we do things. Ultimately, you have two choices. You either can decide to throw away the strategy because it is so inconsistent with the way that our culture is that it's not going to work. And that may be one approach. I like the second approach, though, and this was the approach that Lou Gerstner took when he took over IBM and said, you know, we've got to change. We've got to decouple from that old narrative and find a new way to do things. He brought them into the fortress. He locked the doors. He made the changes internally, and he said to people, get on and hold on tight because we're going to go for a ride, and it's going to be dangerous, and it's going to be different, and it's not going to be something you're comfortable with. But if you want to be with IBM and you're ready for this fun change, let's do it. Throw out all the old ideas and let's open up our minds to something new. That's really hard because, again, as I said, people don't like change and they don't like to be changed. What you may find is you're going to have a huge amount of turnover and layoffs that are going to happen because you're going to sort of weed out the old guard that doesn't like the change and bring in people that are buying into the new change. So in that situation where you have to make some radical changes that are going to be really inconsistent with the way you've always done business and really inconsistent with your current culture, you really have to either change the strategy or tell people to strap on and be ready for a bumpy ride. But it can be done. And we have great examples of companies that have done that and have been incredibly successful after that point in time. Moving beyond corporate culture, it's also really important to recognize international or national culture. Each country has a unique culture to itself, and a unique way of seeing the world, a unique way that they perceive the role of women, the role of men, the role of authority, whether we're more collectivistic or individualistic, how oriented we are to particular time frames. Each national culture differs on these things, and as we do business and as we are working in a more of a global economy, we have to be aware that the people that we do business with, whether they're customers or future employees or suppliers, do business in a very different way, and these things will influence the kinds of decisions that we make. For example, individualistic versus collectivistic. The United States is considered one of the most individualistic cultures. It is not number one. Number two is Australia. And certainly if you think about American history and Australian history and some parallels and similarities they have, it makes sense. The rugged individual against the world, you know, can succeed. You know, and that's a myth because we all know that we don't exist as individuals without being dependent on others. Even those rugged individuals living on the frontier depended on each other for safety, support, food, water, friendship, in connection. And while we were more isolated, we still needed to depend on our neighbors and to depend on others for support. Certainly even the Pilgrims as they came here, you know, the old myth of, you know, working hand in hand with the Native Americans who were living here at the time for their own survival. We don't, live individually anymore and can't live individually anymore. But it's a great myth and it's a great story, which is one of the reasons why it tends to be the values that we, hold dear here in the United States, how important it is for the individual to be honored for their efforts. this is in contrast to a collectivistic cultures, and sort of Asian cultures are more collectivistic, where it's always about the good of the group and not the good of the people, not the good of the individual. In fact, you might find that Asian cultures are much more focused on social justice, or they're more focused on virtue ethics, or maybe even utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest amount of people, as opposed to there's just one right way to do things and that's just all there is to it. Because they're much more interested in what value comes to the group, not to the individual. So if you're trying to make decisions and you're an individualist and you're working with collectivists, you might encourage your people to make decisions along individualistic values, but they're more thinking about the collective and the whole and what's good for the whole. And so remember, we talked in the first lecture about those differences between behavioral focused and conceptual focused and decisive leaders and directive leaders and analyzers. This is a great example of that. You have an individual who's got has a certain focus, but then the collectivistic person is much more like that behavioral person. They're interested in the group and making sure the process works well. So, national culture can influence someone's decision-making style very, very easily. Another dimension of Hofstede's dimensions of national culture would be power distance and our comfort with power distance. When it is a low, small power distance culture where it don't like differences in classes and power differences. Great Britain, for example, has a strong sense of social class. Of the Lords versus the House of Commons, and the royalty versus and the Lords versus commoners, and there's clear differences there. I wouldn't say that it's a high issue at this point in time because royalty tends to be much more symbolic there than anything else, but nonetheless, these power distances are huge, and we see these power distances, for example, in the caste systems in India. And while they have been outlawed per se, we still see that there are differences in different classes and what the expectations are around your behaviors and who you will marry and who you can socialize with. Here in the United States, we care very little for that. We have our celebrities, right? Those are our royalty. But by and large, we like to believe that we are no better or worse or different than anybody else in authority, and that anybody can get ahead, that there's not anything inherent in a social class to get people ahead. I think fundamentally we believe that, whether or not it manifests itself in some of the economic issues that we see today with the distribution of wealth. That's a different issue. But the country as a whole has a lot of discomfort around differences in power and authority. We don't really like and honor that as well. But there are other cultures where those power differences are really huge. And so if I'm a kind of person who works with my subordinates to give them and empower them to make really good decisions, and for me not to tell them what to do, if I have subordinates that come from large power distance cultures, they're not going to feel as empowered to be able to make decisions. They may be more empowered to simply defer to what I want or what they think I want, and to not question my authority. And that can be a real problem when we have to make decisions in a crisis. Particularly when you see that there's a problem and you don't feel empowered to be able to tell me that I've made a mistake. And we recognize this has been a huge issue in all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of industries, particularly in the airline industry, when the second in command or the subordinates didn't feel like they could speak up, and they had to just go along for the ride, whether or not they liked it. So power distance affects decision-making, particularly in a crisis situation. The next two dimensions of Hofstede's definition of national culture comes around uncertainty avoidance and masculinity and femininity. The uncertainty avoidance is basically how comfortable we are with structure and order and rules. Do we like structure, or are we more favor weak, unstructured situations? Do we like uncertainty, or do we resist uncertainty? And there are some cultures that are very, very comfortable with uncertainty, and some that are really fearful of anything that's uncertain. And the more uncomfortable they are with uncertainty, the more challenges they're going to have making decisions in a crisis, making decisions when they don't have enough information. So again, to be really careful about who you put in charge, and recognize that if one of your subsidiaries is dealing with a crisis of some sort, if they are very strong in their need for structure and really explicit rules, they may be really unable to function when there is a crisis. I mean, we have to make sure we take that into account. Next, the idea of masculinity and femininity. Masculinity is much more about the tough values. They focus on success and money and jobs with very clear gender roles. Masculine cultures are like Japan and Australia and some Middle Eastern countries. And then feminine countries, feminine cultures, more about personal relationships and quality of life, and where there are less distinct gender roles. And the Scandinavian countries are very feminine. We know that men and women can both take very long paternity leaves, that people are guaranteed their jobs when they get back. There's no differences really in pay and expectations for people. Everybody is challenged to work hard, and everybody works hard. So that's the feminine side of things. And again, you can see if you are focused on money and assertiveness and competition from a masculine culture, a feminine culture, and individuals from a feminine culture are going to resist that. They're going to be more focused on something very different. Their values will be very different. And that will be at odds when it comes to deciding which values should rule out, which path makes the most sense in terms of the outcomes from the decisions that we make. The next 4 slides are a really long laundry list of different types of national cultures and different ways of thinking about national culture. Hall has some ideas, Kluckhohn and Strodbeck have different ideas about national culture. And so what I want you to do is just review each of the next slides, take some time to absorb and read them. I'm not going to be testing you on, what harmony means versus subjugation, as you can see from this particular slide, but more I want you to really just have a good sense of how different national cultures, the different dimensions on which these national cultures are going to vary. Their relationship to nature, their time orientation, the way that they use words, high context versus low context. All of these are really important nuances, but I don't want to feel like I need to talk you through these. Take some time to read them